Krista spun on her heel. She retreated toward the barricades that blocked 59th. The empty intersection was bathed in a red haze under the traffic signal. She jumped off the curb, splashed through a stream of standing water, and hurtled over the orange barricade. She shifted her direction to the right. She hoped to lose the boys in the darkness. As she passed the General Motors building, she chanced a quick look at the street behind her. 3 of the 4 boys ran through the rain. The 4th barely jogged as he struggled to keep up with his counterparts. The rain seemed to thicken. It streamed down her forehead, covered her eyes, and blurred the dark road ahead. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the sound flooded her ears. She struggled to hear how closely the group of boys followed behind her. Darkness shrouded everything. The streetlights were out, probably due to construction. All that lit her way were overhead traffic signals with bright shades of green, yellow, and red. They fought to be seen through the rain as they colored the falling drops in a hazy glow. What would happen if they caught her? No, that wasn't an option. Krista pushed herself to run faster. Her heart beat like a hammer, painfully striking her ribs. She couldn't let them catch her. On the left, she glanced at the closed buildings lining the empty street. They towered over her like giants who tried to crowd, surround, and trap her. Krista raced blindly through a foggy cloud of rain. The longer she ran, the further she got from her apartment. Her heart sank as she crossed Lexington. She was too far away to run home. At the Lexington intersection, barricades marked an area the crew hadn't started yet. The cones still blocked all traffic, and the power to the streetlights hadn't been disrupted. Now that she had light to run under, she felt exposed. Krista's right foot landed in a 3-inch deep puddle. Her footing stumbled, and she lost a fraction of her precious lead. It occurred to her to shift direction. She could try to run south toward her house, or with any luck, a precinct. If they had any knowledge of the city, it would be easier for them to grab her if she changed direction. The momentum she'd lose might give her pursuers the opportunity they needed to close in on her. By the time she ran the block, they'd cut through the alley and head her off before she crossed 58th. She ruled out changing direction and instead sprinted down 59th. Once the barricades ended, traffic would resume. A cab could save her. This construction couldn't last forever. Hopefully, it didn't outlast her endurance. Another look over her shoulder confirmed these boys were determined in their chase. She ran through the stitch forming in her side. Wide, empty traffic lanes felt like glue under her feet. It pulled at her and tried to slow her down. Krista forced herself to keep going as her shoes pounded across the next intersection, Park Avenue. The intersection disappeared as quickly as it appeared. It faded behind her like a shadow in the rainy, wet darkness. The next street did the same, and Krista began to lose hope. Her legs hurt and her side ached. She wondered how much farther she'd be able to keep running. Rain fell in thick sheets and pooled in large puddles around her. Her speed slowed as her body gradually gave up the fight. It wouldn't be much longer before she lost to exhaustion. Krista quickly worked through her second wind. As a last hope, she squinted through the drops falling from the night sky and sent up a quick prayer. Ahead, like a beacon in a stormy sea, she saw it. A single red and yellow neon light in the distance. Krista didn't know what it was, but it sparked a hope she hadn't felt since she found her pursuers on the dark corner. She headed toward the light, an old red brick building, hidden easily behind larger structures hovering over it like protective parents. As she closed in, Krista kept her eye on the yellow blur. Red neon lights slowly formed letters. Although the C and K failed to light with the rest of the sign, Krista easily made out Nick's place. The sign hung from a pole above the door, red letters framed in a pale lemon-yellow neon border. Krista felt like she'd run the entire length of the island as she splashed and slid in a stream of water collecting by the door. She fell to her knees and glanced to the left to see just how much time she had. James was the only boy still in pursuit. He quickly closed the gap to a mere 10 feet of space. Every muscle in her legs cramped as she feebly reached for the door handle in the struggle to get her feet back under her. Krista thrust the door open. Her shaky hand reached for the door jamb as she darted inside and threw a chair behind her to block her attacker's path. She staggered to the third table. took a deep breath, and prayed someone in this hole-in-the-wall bar would step in to help her. It was all she could do to twist her body into a half-turn to watch the open doorway. She had barely taken in the first full gulp of stale, smoky air when the doorway filled with a dangerous young man determined to catch her. He stood at the threshold, his chest heaving with each breath as he narrowed his eyes at Krista. He took a step closer. "What do you think you're doing, Jimmy?" Krista tore her eyes away from James. She searched for the owner of the deep voice. The culprit turned out to be a heavy-set man who stood behind a thick oak bar. Her eyes fell back on James, surprised to see he stopped his advance mid-step. He paused with one foot inside and used the other to prop the door open. If he wasn't willing to enter the bar, it meant he feared the bartender. Krista slowly backed through the crowd of low tables and avoided the questionable glances. "This has nothing to do with you," James warned from the doorway. As soon as the words left his mouth, 2 more of his gang members appeared behind him and hovered like hungry wolves ready to feast. "Maybe not," the bartender agreed. "That was before you brought your mess into my bar." The sparse amount of people in the small bar turned to stare at Krista. Her clothes were soaked. Her hair was disheveled, and no matter how much air she took in, it wasn't enough to replenish her lungs. She looked like a mangy, tattered rat that crawled in from the cold. Krista scanned the bar's occupants. Curious eyes watched her, mainly from a group of 4 men who sat 2 tables away. She continued to inch closer to the bar. Her fingers barely touched the thick oak when James spoke again. "I'm not leaving until I get what I want." Krista watched the creases in the bartender's forehead deepen. She wondered if he dealt with these boys often. The bartender placed one palm on the bar and leaned forward. "What do you want?" James nodded toward Krista. "Just the girl." "Why?" The bartender glared. "Because I found her first." The bartender held his gaze. He dared James and his friends to take what they wanted. James didn't move into the bar. He held his ground from the doorway, his eyes on Krista. The young gang leader opened his mouth to continue the argument, but the bartender had enough. "Get out," grunted a voice low enough to make Krista's insides cringe. "Hey, I don't want your kind in here," the bartender ordered. "Take your boys and go." "Look," James said in an even tone, "this is the 4th time you've stuck your nose in my business. You don't want me as your enemy. Now, just give me the girl, and I'll go." There was a slight movement as the bartender shuffled behind Krista. James's eyes widened with sudden shock. "Hey, man, easy." "You're wrong, Jimmy. It's me you don't want as your enemy. Now, get out." Krista tried to retreat further, but her back was already pressed against the bar. The patrons calmly eased from the center tables and moved toward the side of the bar. They stood with their drinks in hand and watched the exchange with mild curiosity. None of them spoke or intervened. They just craned their necks from side to side as the conversation shifted from the middle-aged bartender to the young man in the doorway. James pointed at Krista. "Do you even know that girl?" "Doesn't matter. I'm not about to hand her over to you." The bartender's tone left no room for argument. "Get out. That's your last warning. I won't say it again." James cut his eyes back to Krista. "I'll be watching for you." He balled his fist and punched the door frame, then stepped outside and kicked the door closed. The door hit the frame with a slam that echoed throughout the small bar. The silence drifted into hushed murmurs and shuffling feet as people made their way back to their seats. Krista wasn't sure how many times the customers had seen violent encounters, but most seemed almost nonchalant and simply waited it out to continue their conversations. The 4 men who occupied the table near the door all stared at her. She tore her eyes away from them and turned her back on everyone. She realized why James didn't try to enter the bar to pursue his chase. The bartender lowered a wooden-handled shotgun and casually placed it back under the bar. Krista held her head low. "I'm sorry." He looked at her. "For what?" "I didn't mean to cause you any trouble." The bartender almost laughed. "Trust me, getting rid of that little hood rat is no trouble at all." The sudden rush of cool air caused an involuntary shiver. She pulled her wet jacket tighter as she looked over her head for the vent. When she lowered her gaze, she found the bartender still watching her with a friendly smile. He wore a white shirt and blue jeans with an apron tied around his waist. A stained white towel was draped over his right shoulder. He wasn't what she'd call fat, but he certainly didn't take an interest in exercise. Krista ran her fingers through her soaked hair, pushed it out of her face, and slowly climbed onto the nearest bar stool. Her eyes drifted down to the bar when the bartender's heavy gaze continued to watch her. "Do you know those guys?" Krista asked as she adjusted herself on the stool. "Jimmy? Yeah, I know him and his friends. Known them since they were young. Bad group of kids. James thinks he's the most dangerous thug around. His younger brother hangs out with him. The others are just kids. Anyone he can pick up off the street who is willing to follow and do pretty much anything he tells them to do." "Like what?" Krista asked. He pulled the towel off his shoulder and began to wipe the bar in a set circular pattern. "Steal, jack cars, vandalism, rape, murder." He shrugged. "Whatever suits him." Krista's mouth dropped open. "He gets by with this?" The bartender leaned closer. "Cops have his name, even picked him up a few times. Problem is, nothing ever sticks." Krista shook her head sadly. "What's this world coming to?" she asked, though she didn't expect an answer. She couldn't think of anything else to say. But the bartender still hung around. She met his friendly brown eyes and tried to figure out why he continued to stare at her. "Thank you for your help." He picked up the towel and slung it back over his shoulder. "Think nothing of it. Can I get you something to drink?" Krista stammered over her words. She didn't want a drink, but under the circumstances, the least she could do was buy a beer from the man who just saved her life. "Sure." She scanned the selection. "How about a Michelob Light?" "You got an ID?" Krista smiled. She pulled out the card and set it on the bar. Nick grabbed it, checked the date, and compared the picture with her face. He laid it on the bar in front of her. "Coming right up." The glass bottle dropped on the bar in front of her. She raised her eyes back to the bartender. "Thank you." She stared at the brown glass bottle. For what seemed like hours, she mulled over all the disasters in her life. Her decision to marry Christian simply because he had gotten her pregnant. Staying with him had ended in tragedy. Now, here she was, 23 years old, expected to raise a little girl on her own, while her no-good murderer of a husband ran free. Tears welled in her eyes. What did she do to deserve this? She took the abuse. She nearly died to protect her daughter. All for what? So Christian might one day get away with murder? If it was the last thing she did, Krista would make sure her husband did not get away with killing her father. "We're closing up." Krista raised her eyes to the bartender again. His smile was kind. His expression still welcomed her to his little bar. She offered him a slight nod as she twisted on the stool. It took her by surprise when she noticed the rest of the bar had emptied. "What time is it?" The bartender grabbed the empty beer bottle, her third one of the night. 10 after 2. 10 after 2? Krista asked incredulously. "Already?" He used the stained towel to clean the bar with small circles. "Yes, ma'am." Krista reached into her pocket. "It's Krista." "Name's Nick," he said with a smile. "So tell me, Krista, what brings a woman like you out here?" Krista huffed a sort of laugh as she stood off the stool. "Have I walked into a cliché? Maybe, but I wouldn't be open this late if I owned a jewelry store. I don't like discos and hip-hop clubs make too much noise. I'm just a guy who owns a bar. Do you want to talk about what has you out tonight or not?" She hesitated. "I've had a bad couple of years," she answered. Nick merely smiled. Krista knew this conversation was far from over.